First up, we have to remove these two bolts, the nut here, and loosen this bolt. 10mm socket. Socket again on the nut here. Don't drop it. Now with the cover off from the AC pump, we can access the bolt that holds the cover onto the alternator. That one uses a 12mm socket. Just have to loosen it up. And then on the left, another 10mm. This just lifts up and off. I'm going to be replacing the idler pulley down there, which means I can either loosen it up and remove the bracket, or I can remove both belts. I want to replace the belt on the AC pump as well, so I have to take the belt off of the alternator to do that. First up, you want to loosen the bolt underneath the belt here. That's what's holding the tension on the alternator. It can be quite tight. You just loosen it off. And then on the top, there's a bolt there, the 12mm head, and you want to loosen that off to lower the alternator down and take the tension off the belt. With the tension off, you can remove the belt. Next, we have to take the tension off of the belt on the AC pump. It's the same idea, except the bolt holding it in place is much lower. For this, we'll need a 12mm combination wrench. And just loosen the bolt there. It can be quite tight. And then with that loosened off, we want to loosen up the tensioner bolt there. It's 12mm again. And this one you'll have to loosen all the way off, more or less. And then you can remove the belt. Finally, because I actually want the idler pulley, we have to remove these two bolts up top to get access to it. And they can also be very rusted on and tight on an older car. And unfortunately, they have to come all the way off. And because of the bracket here, the only way to do that is with a box end wrench. You can't actually get, actually you can get a socket just barely in there, but once it backs off, it's gonna run into the radiator here. If you had a squatter socket and a ratcheting wrench, you can maybe do it. They also make ratcheting box end wrenches. I don't have one. And it's really tight on the bracket here. This is 12mm. And there's a second bolt there, which I'll loosen off again and then remove by hand because it's faster. It's quite tight in here with the radiator. Be careful not to drop either the bolt or the bracket into the engine when doing this, because after this bolt is free, the bracket and the idler pulley can fall into the engine, or at least onto the skid plate. And this right here is what's causing the squeaking. The bearing's all gunked up. So next up, we have to remove this nut to get the pulley off of there. Two parts like this, and then out of the center of the pulley, we want this little holder. It should just come out. It can be quite tight. There you go. This is the replacement pulley I got compared to the old one. Same diameter. New, old. I don't know if you can hear that. You can hear the bearings in that guy. And the new one, smooth as butter. Now, it doesn't specify which way it wants to rotate, since it's asymmetrical here. I'm gonna put this side to the back of the car facing the engine. It just feels right. It's kind of the holy side towards the back, which means popping this in like so. And there's a little, this little slot there has to line up with this guy, this slot. So it goes in there, and that goes on there, and there's clearance for it to spin. Nut goes back on. Just finger tight because we need to adjust the tension later. And then back in the car, pulley faces towards the back with the open side on the bracket towards you. Gonna put these nuts or these bolts in just finger tight by hand at first. Second bolt. I don't have a torque spec for these two bolts, and I couldn't get a torque wrench in there anyways, so I'm just going to do them snug. So once they stop turning, I'm going to snug them up and call it good. Considering how tightly they were in there before, I think it'll be all right. I'm also replacing the belt. The other belt had already been replaced, but the one on the AC pump hadn't. So I've got a new belt here. This can be pretty tight. I'm going on the crank pulley first. I'm looping it below the tensioner, the idler, and then over the AC pump. This is the tight part. There we go. Just making sure it's aligned with the grooves on every pulley. Back to clockwise with the 12mm socket to tension that back up. I'm just making sure it's aligned again. It is. The alternator's just rubbing up a little bit there. The manual specifies when installing new parts, so I've put a new belt on there. For the belt that goes over the AC pump and the idler pulley, which is the one I did, it should deflect 7.5 to 8.5mm. That's a lot more than 7.5mm. Could even go a little tighter than that. That looks about right to me. And now to lock down the nut on the front there. If you didn't know, this car has a little port in the bottom. You can grab stuff out like that. The torque spec for this is 17 foot-pounds, but I can't get a torque wrench in there, it's too tight. So I'm going to do it tight, snug. To me that feels like about 17 foot-pounds. Now putting the other belt back on, the alternator belt. Again, starting with the crank there, and probably the alternator, or the power steering pump next, and then the alternator, which I've tightened up too much. There we go. At inspection, so with the belt that was already on there, this is the generator belt, it should deflect 9 to 11mm. That looks about right to me. Next up, we have to retighten the lock nut on the alternator here to keep that tension on. Torque spec for this one is 18.1 foot-pounds. Next up, we reinstall the covers, starting with the cover on the alternator on the left. There's two washers here on this bolt. Make sure that this goes in between the two washers. As so. 10mm. And none of these have torque specs. Tighten this guy down. So I'm doing it snug. Cover that goes back on the AC pump has to go under this little tab here, hook onto the bolt over here. It sits nicely. This here used to have red Loctite on it. I've only got blue, so I will be using blue Loctite. And the nut back over here on this bolt. No torque specs for any of this. 10mm sockets. 10 again.